The clinical white light of the Austin Medical Center ceiling felt like a cold interrogation, while the rhythmic, irritating beep of the heart monitor provided the only soundtrack to my isolation. I am Sloane, a 30-year-old financial consultant who thought she had finally secured a private sanctuary, but a single vibration from my phone on the bedside table shattered that illusion instantly. The message was from my father, and it was not asking about my post-surgery recovery or my pain levels, but rather a cold declaration that he had handed my house keys to my sister. He claimed that since I was hospitalized, the property was being wasted, so he decided she should move in immediately because he viewed my hard-earned home as collective family property. I did not scream, nor did I send a frantic reply to challenge his blatant theft, because the shock had already hardened into a calculated freezing rage that settled deep within my chest. They assumed my physical weakness meant a total loss of control, yet they had no idea that their entitled decision was the final spark that would lead to a total bridge burning they could never recover from. Before I reveal how I handled this betrayal while trapped in a hospital bed, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that family should respect boundaries, regardless of the circumstances, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our community for more stories about standing up for yourself. Growing up in the sprawling suburbs of Austin, within a household that functioned more like a high-stakes emotional brokerage than a family, taught me that my only inherent value was my utility to the collective. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor, had long ago established a domestic hierarchy where my sister Caitlin sat at the absolute apex as their undisputed golden child, while I was relegated to the role of the silent, sturdy foundation. They did not raise me to be a daughter so much as they engineered me to be a fail-safe mechanism, a reliable source of stability and capital that they could tap into whenever Caitlin's life inevitably spiraled out of control. The disparity in our treatment was not merely a subtle preference, but was a documented financial and emotional strategy that dictated every facet of our formative years. I vividly remember the summer I turned 18, when I worked 3 separate jobs to save for my college textbooks, only to watch my father hand Caitlin the keys to a brand new convertible, as a reward for simply graduating high school with mediocre grades. Arthur would often lean back in his chair and tell me that my exhausting schedule was a gift because it was building the kind of rugged character that successful people needed. Yet he never applied that same logic to his favorite daughter. My mother, Eleanor, was the primary enforcer of this dynamic, frequently reminding me that because I was the capable and strong one, I had a moral obligation to ensure that Caitlin never had to experience the discomfort of reality. By the time I established my career as a senior financial consultant, the expectation that my earnings were communal family property had become a dangerous cornerstone of our relationship. I spent my late 20s watching my parents liquidate their own retirement savings to finance Caitlin's failed business ventures, ranging from an organic candle boutique to a high-end travel blog that never gained a single follower. When their own funds finally ran dry, they turned their gaze toward me with a sense of entitlement that was as chilling as it was predictable. My father would call me not to ask about my life or my well-being, but to inform me that I needed to cover the mortgage on their house because they had given my sister the money intended for the bank. If I ever dared to question this arrangement or suggested that Caitlin should perhaps find a stable job, my mother would break into performative sobs, accusing me of being a cold and heartless accountant who valued numbers over the bond of blood. They had successfully weaponized my own competence against me, making me feel that my success was a debt I owed them for the privilege of being the only functioning adult in the family tree. This environment of constant financial extraction forced me to become highly secretive about my true net worth, as I knew that any visible sign of prosperity would be immediately identified as a resource to be harvested for Caitlin's benefit. I recall a specific Thanksgiving dinner where Caitlin complained about her outdated apartment, and my father looked me dead in the eye and suggested that I should pay her security deposit for a luxury loft in the city center. When I pointed out that I was already paying for her health insurance and her car notes, the table went silent as if I had uttered a profound profanity against the very sanctity of motherhood. Eleanor told me that I was being greedy and that my refusal to help my sister was a stain on the family name, a sentiment that Arthur reinforced by claiming that my wealth was a result of the stable home they had provided for me. They never acknowledged the 80-hour work weeks or the crushing stress of my profession, choosing instead to believe that I had simply stumbled into a gold mine that belonged to everyone with the same last name. This toxic architecture of guilt was designed to keep me in a state of perpetual service, ensuring that I would never feel entitled to keep the fruits of my labor for myself. I was the load-bearing wall of a structure that was constantly being weakened by the people it was protecting, and the cracks were starting to show long before I ever stepped foot into that hospital room. They did not see the person behind the paycheck, only a nameless, faceless ATM that they expected to remain operational, regardless of the personal cost to my health or happiness. This long history of systemic exploitation is what allowed them to justify the theft of my keys, as they had long ago convinced themselves that my boundaries were merely suggestions that they had the right to ignore. In their minds, I was not an individual with rights and a private life, but a subsidiary of the family corporation that was currently undergoing a hostile takeover by its own board of directors. Every sacrifice I had made to buy my independence was viewed by them as an act of rebellion that needed to be suppressed, and my eventual illness was the opportunity they had been waiting for to re-establish their dominance. The transition from being a family resource to establishing my own sanctuary began 3 years ago when I officially closed on the purchase of my penthouse in downtown Austin. I remember the sharp smell of fresh paint and the way the floor-to-ceiling windows captured the golden Texas sunset, providing me with a sense of peace that I had never experienced in my parents' house. This property was more than just a real estate investment because it represented the physical manifestation of every hour of overtime and every social sacrifice I had made to escape the toxic cycle of my upbringing. When I finally allowed my parents to visit for the first time, I watched the immediate shift in their expressions from feigned pride to a cold, calculating envy that made my skin crawl. My father, Arthur, did not congratulate me on my achievement, but instead began walking through the rooms as if he were an insurance adjuster, estimating the value of the art on the walls and the cost of the custom cabinetry. My mother, Eleanor, spent the entire evening making passive-aggressive comments about how selfish it was for one person to occupy so much space, when her beloved Caitlin was still struggling in a cramped studio apartment on the edge of town. They did not see a daughter who had finally found security, but rather a hoard of wealth that was being unfairly withheld from the person they deemed more deserving of luxury. I had specifically instructed the building's concierge that under no circumstances were my parents or my sister to be given access codes or spare keys without my express verbal confirmation for each visit. This boundary was treated by Eleanor as an act of high treason, and she frequently reminded me during our rare phone calls that family should never have secrets or locked doors between them. The tension reached a boiling point during the last holiday season when I refused to let Caitlin host a New Year's Eve party in my home, knowing that her friends would likely cause thousands of dollars in damages that I would be expected to cover. My father had shouted that I was forgetting my roots, and that the penthouse was a family asset that should be used for the benefit of everyone, not just the one who happened to hold the deed. The bitterness of my current situation was compounded by the staggering realization that I had spent the entirety of my adult life serving as the silent financial engine for the very people who were now dismantling my existence. Long before I was lying in this hospital bed, watching the slow drip of my intravenous fluids, I had functioned as a human safety net for every poor decision and reckless impulse that my parents and sister had ever entertained. I can still vividly recall the frantic phone call I received 5 years ago when my father confessed that he had mismanaged the company payroll taxes to the point where the government was threatening to seize his commercial property. Without a moment of hesitation or a demand for a formal repayment plan, I liquidated a significant portion of my early investment portfolio to transfer $45,000 into his business account to keep him from ruin. There was no celebratory dinner or even a sincere phone call to acknowledge that I had saved his professional reputation, as he simply absorbed the money and later told my mother that I was lucky to have such a profitable career to help the family. My sister Caitlin was even more predatory in her expectations of my generosity, frequently treating my bank account as a bottomless reservoir for her self-inflicted crises. I remember the time she decided to quit her steady administrative job because the office lighting was not conducive to her creative energy, leaving her unable to pay her $4,000 monthly rent for her trendy apartment. Instead of letting her face the natural consequences of her unemployment, my mother called me in a state of manufactured panic, claiming that the stress of eviction would cause Caitlin a permanent psychological breakdown. I ended up paying her rent for 6 consecutive months, while she spent her days posting photos of expensive brunches and new outfits that were clearly purchased with the money I had intended for my own retirement savings. Whenever I tried to set a firm boundary or suggest that they should develop a budget, the emotional retaliation from my parents was swift and devastatingly effective. They had mastered the art of making me feel like an outsider in my own family, often implying that my financial success was a cold and sterile substitute for the warmth and spontaneity that Caitlin supposedly brought to the table. My father would often say that money was just paper, and that the only thing that truly mattered was the unconditional support we gave to one another, which was his coded way of saying that my assets were communal. During one particularly painful Christmas gathering, I discovered that my mother had been using the supplementary credit card I gave her for emergencies to pay for Caitlin's luxury spa retreats and high-end fitness memberships. When I confronted her about the $10,000 balance that had accumulated in less than 90 days, Eleanor looked at me with genuine confusion and asked why I was being so petty about such a small amount of money. She argued that since I was earning more than the rest of the family combined, it was only fair that I subsidized a lifestyle for my sister that was commensurate with our family's perceived social status. They never saw the late nights I spent staring at complex spreadsheets or the missed holidays I spent working in foreign time zones to earn that income, because in their eyes, my work was effortless and my wealth was infinite. My best friend Grant, who also served as my legal counsel, had spent years witnessing this cycle of exploitation with a mixture of horror and professional concern. He was the one who insisted that I draft a strict trust and keep my primary property deeds in a secure digital vault specifically, because he knew that my family's entitlement would eventually reach a breaking point. Grant often remarked that I was not a daughter to them, but rather a high-yield investment that they intended to liquidate as soon as the opportunity presented itself. While I was recovering from surgery, Grant was the only person who inquired about the logistics of my long-term care and the security of my professional obligations, while my parents were preoccupied with the luxury amenities of my penthouse. The irony of the situation was that while I was paying the premium for my parents' private health insurance, they were actively plotting to move my sister into my home without paying a single cent of the mortgage. They viewed my illness as a divine redistribution of wealth, a chance for the golden child to finally have the palace she deserved, without the inconvenient presence of the sister who had actually paid for it. My father had the audacity to suggest to the hospital social worker that they should manage my finances while I was in recovery, a request that was fortunately denied, because Grant had already been established as my power of attorney. Despite all the evidence of their selfishness, I had still maintained a hope that they would show a shred of humanity when I was physically broken and vulnerable. Instead, the messages I received from my mother during my second week of hospitalization were filled with subtle hints about how much more Caitlin would appreciate my living room than I ever did. She mentioned that since I was so busy with work anyway, I probably didn't even notice the view or the high-end appliances that I had carefully selected. This was their way of devaluing my ownership, of making it seem like I was an unworthy steward of my own property so that they could justify giving it to someone else. I realized that my years of silent sacrifice had not bought me a single ounce of loyalty or love, but had only fueled a deep-seated resentment in their hearts. They hated me for being the one who could provide, and they loved the provision while despising the provider. Every dollar I had ever given them was a brick in the wall they were now building to shut me out of my own life. As I lay in the quiet of the night listening to the hum of the hospital equipment, the sheer scale of their betrayal finally crystallized in my mind. They were not my family. They were a group of people who had been waiting for me to falter so they could finally claim the spoils of a war they had never fought. The realization was more painful than any surgical incision, but it was also the catalyst for the cold and absolute decision I was about to make regarding our collective future. The trajectory of my life took a terrifying and unexpected turn 6 weeks ago, when a sudden searing pain in my abdomen caused me to collapse during a late-night conference call in my home office. I managed to dial emergency services before losing consciousness, and I woke up 48 hours later in a sterile hospital room with a surgical drain in my side and a haze of heavy sedatives clouding my mind. Because I was incapacitated and unable to communicate during the initial admission process, the hospital staff contacted my parents, as they were listed as my primary emergency contacts in my records. Arthur and Eleanor arrived at the facility with a speed that I initially mistook for genuine parental concern, but the reality of their presence was far more predatory than I could have imagined. While I was drifting in and out of a drug-induced sleep following a complicated emergency procedure, my mother was not holding my hand or praying for my recovery as a normal parent might do. Instead, she was quietly and efficiently searching through the contents of my designer work bag, which had been transported to the room along with my personal belongings from the scene of my collapse. She found the hidden interior pocket where I kept my secondary key fob and the heavy brass physical key that served as my last resort for the high-security locks on my front door. Instead of securing these items or handing them to the hospital vault for safekeeping, Eleanor slipped them into her own purse with the practiced grace of a seasoned thief. By the second day of my recovery, when the fog of anesthesia began to lift and I found the strength to ask about my personal items, my father assured me with a hollow smile that everything was being handled. He told me that I should focus entirely on my healing and that I didn't need to worry about the trivial details of my apartment or my mail because they were taking care of everything for me. I was too weak to challenge the vague nature of his promises, and my physical pain was so intense that the location of my keys felt like a secondary concern compared to the struggle of taking a full breath. I did not realize then that while I was fighting to regain my mobility, my parents had already made multiple trips to my penthouse to survey my inventory and plan their next move. They moved through my private sanctuary like conquerors, touching my books and sitting on my furniture, deciding amongst themselves that I was no longer fit to manage such a significant asset. Eleanor had convinced herself that my medical crisis was a sign from the universe that I was too high-strung, and that the responsibility of homeownership was what had caused my physical collapse in the first place. She whispered to my father that they were actually saving me from the stress of my own life by stepping in to manage my affairs without my knowledge or consent. This delusion allowed them to bypass any lingering traces of guilt they might have felt about violating the most basic boundaries of trust between a parent and a child. They viewed my unconscious state as a legal and moral vacancy, an opportunity to finally redistribute my wealth in a way that favored Caitlin, who had been complaining about her rent for months. As I lay in that hospital bed staring at the slowly dripping IV bag, I was completely unaware that the very people who had watched me grow up were currently erasing my existence from the home I had built. They had already decided that my recovery would not include a return to my previous life, as they were busy preparing the space for its new occupant. The betrayal was not just in the taking of the keys, but in the total lack of regard for my dignity as a human being, while I was at my most vulnerable. They were not waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for me to be gone so they could finally enjoy the fruits of a labor they had never contributed a single second toward. By the 10th day of my confinement within the sterile walls of the Austin Medical Center, the digital evidence of my family's betrayal began to surface with a brazenness that defied all logic and decency. I was scrolling through my social media feed with trembling fingers when I saw a series of high-resolution photographs posted by Caitlin that made my heart feel as though it had been plunged into a bucket of ice. There was my sister draped across my custom velvet sofa in a silk robe that I recognized as my own, holding a crystal glass filled with a vintage champagne I had been saving for a major career milestone. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive entitlement, claiming that she was finally starting a new chapter in a space that truly reflected her soul, and thanking the universe for her wonderful new downtown life. She had not only moved her entire wardrobe into my walk-in closet, but had also rearranged my personal library to make room for her collection of vapid fashion magazines and overpriced candles. My father, Arthur, sent me a follow-up text message shortly after the photos went live, stating with a chilling lack of emotion that since the penthouse was much closer to Caitlin's new social obligations, it only made sense for her to remain there indefinitely. He phrased this theft as a logical family optimization, completely ignoring the fact that I had spent nearly a decade of my life working 16-hour days to afford every square inch of that property. He told me that as an older sister who is already successful, I should find joy in providing a stable platform for Caitlin to finally find herself, as if my hard-earned home was a laboratory for her failed personality experiments. My mother, Eleanor, joined the psychological assault by calling me later that afternoon to tell me that I was being incredibly selfish for even thinking about the legalities of the situation, while I should be focusing on my spiritual recovery. She had the audacity to suggest that my illness was actually a divine intervention designed to teach me about the virtues of sharing and the emptiness of material possessions. When I tried to argue that my home was a private asset protected by law, her voice turned sharp and venomous as she reminded me that without the family that raised me, I would be nothing but a lonely woman with a large bank account. She claimed that Caitlin was doing me a favor by airing out the apartment and ensuring that the plants were watered, as if my immaculately maintained sanctuary was a derelict building that required a squatter to stay functional. I watched through the screen of my phone as Caitlin hosted a small dinner party for her influencer friends, using the heirloom silver that my grandmother had specifically left to me because she knew I was the only one who would cherish it. They had already contacted the building's IT department by pretending to be my legal guardians, managed to reset the security codes on my smart home system, and effectively locked me out of my own digital ecosystem while I was still tethered to a heart monitor. The sheer coldness of their actions acted as a brutal awakening, stripping away the last remnants of my naive hope that blood relation carried any intrinsic value or loyalty. I realized that to my parents and my sister, I was not a human being with feelings and a future, but a hurdle that had finally been moved out of the way so they could access the resources they felt they were owed. Caitlin posted a video of herself dancing in my kitchen, the very place where I had spent countless nights drinking black coffee and working on financial models to secure my freedom, and the sight of her trivializing my labor was the final spark that ignited my resolve. I did not engage in a frantic text war or waste my breath shouting into the phone, because I knew that any direct confrontation would only give them the opportunity to play the victim and prepare a defensive narrative for their friends. Instead, I lay in the quiet darkness of my hospital room and felt a strange, freezing clarity wash over me, a sensation of total detachment from the people who shared my DNA but possessed none of my integrity. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, calculating the exact value of the betrayal, and realizing that the price of my family's love was apparently the total surrender of my autonomy and my assets. The psychological weight of knowing that my sister was sleeping in my bed and using my most intimate belongings while I was struggling to walk to the bathroom was an indignity that I refused to tolerate for a single day longer than necessary. My father sent another message late that evening telling me not to worry about the mail or the bills because they were taking care of everything, which I knew was a lie intended to keep me from realizing they were intercepting my private documents. They were attempting to erase my presence from my own life, to turn me into a ghost who simply provided the funding for a play in which I was no longer a character. Every sacrifice I had ever made for them, from the $50,000 business bailout to the countless rent payments for Caitlin, was now being used as a justification for why they deserved to take even more. In their twisted logic, my history of giving had established a permanent right for them to take, and my current vulnerability was merely the opening they needed to finalize their conquest. I realized then that if I ever returned to that penthouse while they were still in it, I would never truly be home again, as the space would always be tainted by the memory of their predatory intrusion. This was the moment I reached out to Grant, with a very specific and very final request, knowing that the only way to win this war was to destroy the very prize they were fighting over. I would not be the victim of their entitlement, but the architect of their downfall, using the very financial expertise they had exploited for years to ensure they ended up with absolutely nothing. The bridge was not just being burned. I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on it and watch from a safe distance as the smoke cleared to reveal my new and absolute freedom. The morning after I discovered the digital evidence of my sister's intrusion into my private sanctuary, I requested an urgent and private consultation with Grant, away from the prying eyes of the hospital staff and the occasional unannounced visits from my mother. I forced myself to sit upright in my hospital bed for the first time since the surgery, ignoring the sharp and agonizing protest of my internal stitches, because the necessity of reclaiming my dignity was far more urgent than any physical discomfort I was experiencing. I looked directly into Grant's eyes and told him with a chilling level of certainty that I no longer wanted to own the penthouse in downtown Austin, not because I was incapable of fighting for it, but because I wanted to completely liquidate the very air that Caitlin was currently breathing. Grant did not look surprised by my radical request, as he had already spent the last 48 hours preparing a comprehensive file of potential buyers who had reached out to his firm over the last 6 months regarding the property's prime location and luxury status. He informed me that the Thompson family, a prominent couple involved in high-stakes international commercial real estate, had recently made a standing all-cash offer that was significantly above the current market value, with a guaranteed 3-day closing period. This was the perfect weapon for my counterstrike, a legal transaction so swift and so absolute that by the time my family realized what was occurring, the ground beneath their feet would have already been sold to strangers. We spent the next several hours meticulously going through the digital closing documents on my laptop, ensuring that every signature was witnessed by the hospital's official notary, and that my mental competency was officially documented by my attending physician to prevent any future claims of duress. I felt a strange and intoxicating sense of liberation as I scrolled through the 100-page contract, seeing the legal description of the home I had loved being transformed into a cold financial instrument of my ultimate revenge. Grant facilitated every micro detail of the communication with the Thompsons' legal team, making it explicitly clear that the sale was contingent on a rapid transfer of ownership and an immediate physical possession of the property upon the final closing. While I was electronically signing the final transfer of the deed, I thought about Caitlin currently lounging in my master's suite and wearing my expensive silk robes, completely unaware that the walls surrounding her were no longer protected by the thin and tattered veil of my sisterly loyalty. My father, Arthur, had actually sent me a text message earlier that morning asking for the administrative password to my secondary investment account so he could pay for some supposed emergency repairs on the penthouse, but I simply deleted the message with a cold smile and no second thought. I was no longer the family bank, the reliable safety net, or the silent observer of my own exploitation, as I had finally stepped into the role of the architect of a total and irreversible divestment. The money from the sale was immediately diverted into a new offshore trust that Grant had established specifically to keep my assets entirely out of the reach of any future family litigation or emotional blackmail. I instructed Grant to ensure that the building's management was notified of the change in ownership only minutes before the new owners were scheduled to arrive at the front desk with their private security detail. We also took the liberty of canceling all the utility accounts and the high-speed fiber internet services associated with my name, effectively plunging the penthouse into a digital and functional blackout that would serve as the first warning sign for the squatters. My mother, Eleanor, called me twice while I was finalizing the legal documents likely to complain about the quality of the linens or to ask for more spending money for Caitlin, but I let the phone ring in the quiet room until it finally fell silent. There was a profound and terrifying power in that silence, a realization that by refusing to participate in their domestic drama any longer, I was effectively starving their entitlement of the oxygen it needed to survive. 2 days later, at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the transition of power reached its explosive and public conclusion, while I was being wheeled out of the hospital entrance in a chair I would soon no longer need for my mobility. My phone began to vibrate in my lap with a frantic and rhythmic intensity that signaled the exact moment the Thompson family had arrived at the penthouse entrance with their legal team and a professional locksmith. I chose to answer the 5th consecutive call from my father, and the sound that erupted from the speaker was a chaotic mixture of panic, disbelief, and a desperate screeching fury that made the nearby hospital security guard look at me with genuine concern. Arthur was shouting at the top of his lungs about how there were aggressive strangers in the hallway claiming to own the unit, and how Caitlin was currently locked in the master bathroom because she was terrified of the men who were vowing to remove her by force. I waited patiently for him to take a desperate breath before I spoke in a voice that was as calm and as cold as the marble countertops he had so recently coveted for his favorite daughter's social media posts. I told him with absolute clarity that I had sold the property 48 hours ago, and that since neither he nor Caitlin had a legal lease or my written permission to be there, they were currently committing a felony trespassing offense in the state of Texas. The silence that followed my statement was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my 30 years of life, a vacuum of shock that sucked the air out of his entitled delusions before he began to desperately beg me to call off the police and the new owners. I simply told him that it was no longer my house, and therefore no longer my problem to solve. Then I ended the call and permanently blocked every single phone number and social media account associated with my biological family. According to the detailed incident report that Grant received from the building's security manager later that afternoon, Caitlin was eventually escorted out of the building in her pajamas and slippers, clutching a single designer handbag while her influencer friends watched from the sidewalk in stunned and judgmental silence. The Thompson family did not grant her even 10 minutes to pack her extensive belongings instead, informing her through a megaphone that anything left inside the unit would be treated as abandoned property and donated to a local homeless shelter by the end of the business day. My mother arrived on the scene 20 minutes later in a state of hysterics and attempted to physically assault one of the private security guards, resulting in her being handcuffed, detained, and issued a permanent trespass warning from the entire residential complex. They had spent their entire lives believing that my resources were their natural birthright, but they were finally learning the hard way that the world outside of our toxic domestic circle did not recognize their self-appointed authority over my life. Caitlin's social media feed, which had been filled with arrogant photos of her new home, was suddenly flooded with thousands of comments from confused followers asking why she was sitting on a dirty downtown curb surrounded by cardboard boxes and trash bags. The humiliation was total. The legal defeat was absolute, and the financial safety net they had relied on for decades had been shredded into 1,000 irreparable pieces by the very daughter they had tried to erase from her own home. Arthur's construction business, which was already teetering on the edge of insolvency due to his chronic mismanagement, lost its last chance at survival when the local bank saw the news of his family's public scandal and immediately called in his outstanding loans. They were finally experiencing the cold and hard reality of their own incompetence, without my silent and grueling labor to shield them from the economic wind. I felt no pity for any of them as I watched the Austin skyline recede in the rearview mirror of Grant's car, knowing that every tear Caitlin cried on that sidewalk was a debt she owed to the years of my life she had stolen with my parents' blessing. Currently, I am sitting on a private balcony overlooking a much quieter and more peaceful city, watching the sun dip below the horizon without the crushing and suffocating weight of a family's expectations pressing against my chest. It has been exactly 6 months since I burned the final bridge with my past, and the total silence from my parents and Caitlin is the most expensive and beautiful gift I have ever purchased for myself with my own hard-earned money. I have learned through this agonizing process that being the responsible one in a family is often just a polite and deceptive way of saying that you are the most convenient and reliable person to exploit for the benefit of others. Walking away from them was not an act of impulsive cruelty, but rather a final and necessary act of survival for a woman who had been bled dry by the people who were supposed to be her protectors. My sister is reportedly working a low-level entry-level job and living in a cramped shared apartment that is a far cry from the luxury penthouse she tried to steal from me while I was unconscious. My parents are struggling every day to adjust to a life where they must actually account for every single dollar they spend, having realized too late that their golden daughter's lifestyle was built on the foundation of my suffering. They will likely never understand the depth of their betrayal or why I chose such a scorched earth policy, and they will almost certainly continue to tell anyone who will listen that I am the cold-hearted villain of their family tragedy. However, their narrative no longer has the power to wound me or dictate my choices, because I have finally built a new life that is defined by my own strict boundaries and my own independent successes. This experience was undoubtedly the most painful lesson of my entire existence, yet it was also the most necessary catalyst for my growth, as it forced me to realize that blood relation is never a valid reason to endure a lifetime of theft and emotional manipulation. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for staying with me until the very end of this long, exhausting, and difficult journey of self-reclamation and justice. If you have ever felt like you were being treated as a nameless tool or a financial resource, rather than a human person by the people who are supposed to love you the most, I truly hope my story gives you the courage to stand up and reclaim your own life. Please share your thoughts and your own personal experiences in the comments below, because I truly value your perspectives, and I want to know how you have handled similar betrayals in your own lives. Your support means everything to us and helps us reach more people who might be suffering in silence. So please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to join a community of people who believe in the power of boundaries and the absolute necessity of self-respect. We are always stronger together when we share these difficult truths, and I am so grateful to have you here by my side as I move forward into this new, bright, and independent chapter of my life. Remember that you are the only one who truly owns your future and your happiness, and you never have to apologize to anyone for protecting the sanctuary you have worked so hard to build with your own hands.